Today, we're going to be diving into the critical issues impacting global commerce and supply chain. Obviously, tariffs. The parallels between the current U.S. tariff landscape and the United Kingdom's experience with Brexit. We're going to dig into that a little bit. A number of people have observed the similarities from the economic as well as political drivers behind these events. More importantly, the consequences of how goods are moved and how business operates today. To help us unpack these complex issues, I'm pleased to be joined by Alastair Charatan, a leading voice in supply chain analysis based in the UK. Alastair and I spoke back in January for an episode of the Chain podcast on tariff predictions. And then again, we were joined in LinkedIn Live in February when the tariffs on Canada and Mexico were first announced. Our goal today is not to rehash the political debates. Those are going on, as we all know, but rather to focus on the impacts that the policies have had on supply chains, from trade volumes to cost to strategic adaptations, and more importantly, long-term resiliency. We'll be drawing on direct comparisons between Brexit and the U.S. tariffs and considering these insights and what they mean for businesses and navigating the current environment. Alastair, thanks for joining me today.
It's great to be back and to discussing this topic once more.
Yeah, honestly, in some cases, it must feel like deja vu all over for you again when discussing Brexit or the tariffs. This isn't new for you, but it is different.
Yeah, it certainly is. I mean, there are similarities and there's certainly some differences. I think, I think one of the biggest differences is clearly timescale. Brexit was well announced and took a long time, much longer than people expected, but it was, years and years. In this case, it's literally days, if not hours, things change, which causes a lot of difficulty. I think another big difference is that the UK compared to the EU, the European Union, was really quite small, despite, in advance, the UK thinking, oh, well, the Germans will always want to sell us their cars because we're so important for their market. Well, kind of, yeah, but we were maybe 10% of German car exports in Europe, let alone worldwide. So we weren't as important as all that. And there's no denying that the US is clearly a very important player, but nonetheless, not the dominant trade partner in the whole world when you're looking at that level. And I think the other really important parallel is uncertainty. And that's what was a killer for Brexit, because companies just didn't know what was happening. They didn't know for year after year after year. It wasn't clear what was happening. And in some cases, they just had to take decisions. And I remember helping some clients I was working with and, moving warehouses out of the UK into Europe because you just didn't know what was happening. You couldn't take the risk. And so ironically, in that case, there were a lot of jobs and trade was moved out of the UK, very much against what perhaps the Brexit supporters would have expected and wanted.
It's interesting you point out this sort of the time horizons, as you indicated. It took almost 8 years for Brexit to be fully implemented. But all along the way, there were questions as to what was going to be implemented. So it was extremely difficult to make those long-term decisions. We're facing sort of that same dynamic with the tariffs in terms of the short-term implications of it, but yet we're trying to rearrange long-term supply chains. That dynamic is extremely difficult to balance. Give me a sense how Brexit has responded to that short-term versus that long-term initiatives or investment that you need to really realign the supply chains.
Yeah, well, in the case of Brexit, I mean, there was nothing short-term really. I mean, because I think some perhaps rather naive Brexit supporters somehow thought that things would happen the very day after the vote, and clearly people realised that wasn't going to happen. But so in terms of Brexit, I don't think anyone really expected anything short term. I think what took people by surprise was the fact that the UK really didn't. They just didn't expect Brexit actually to be voted for, and therefore they really weren't ready even for the negotiations. And not for me as a UK citizen to be commenting on the US government, but you do feel that the US government isn't really prepared on this because we've seen so many changes in policy just day by day. Suddenly they realize, oh, iPhones are rather expensive and they're made in China and they will be a lot more expensive. Oh, we'll exempt them. And then now we're hearing, oh, no, but actually semiconductors will be getting some sort of tariff and no one knows what tariff and exactly how it will be defined. So it is a really confusing picture. And I think if there's one thing that was very damaging for the Brexit process in the UK, it was the fact that it was so poorly controlled, communicated, there was no strategy, there was no advanced planning, shared with the trading partners and businesses. And I think that was very damaging indeed, because it meant that some companies did make decisions which, if they'd known more, they may not have had to make. For example, bringing warehouses into Europe because they weren't sure what the customs regime might be and whether small parcels would be allowed and so on. And this uncertainty is extremely damaging, and that's certainly what's happening at the moment with the way tariffs are being managed and announced.
Yeah, interesting. You point out intent, whether short-term or long-term, and protection versus realignment of the supply chain. Tariffs are much more tactical. They're much more policy-driven tools in terms of trade imbalances and protecting certain industries, whereas Brexit was much more structural. I mean, it was trying to, alter the entire trade for, the UK in terms of regulatory landscape and who you can deal with and your partners. Very different in terms of intent, as you're describing here. Were the initial assumptions the same ones that are being carried today in terms of the impact on Brexit, or have the assumptions changed in terms of the structural change that is needed?
Well, I think it's a lot to unpack in that question. I think in terms of what the assumptions and goals of Brexit were, again, I think a little bit like tariffs in the US, is it wasn't really clear what exactly was the intention. Was it to protect trade? Was it to encourage trade? Was it to allow us to trade more freely with other parts of the world? I mean, it was really very, very unclear. And again, that tends to have a sort of a major impact on the difficulty. I think the other part of it is that because it wasn't clear, again, I don't think a lot of the issues have been analyzed fully, and people just didn't really understand. For example, they didn't understand that you can make all sorts of restrictions on EU citizens from not being able to come and work in the UK, which of course was a big driver of a lot of it. It was this slogan, take back control, meaning take back control of our borders and who could come across our borders. But what people hadn't realized was that there were so many industries dependent on those European workers, including agriculture, where a lot of seasonal workers came to pick fruit and vegetables and so on, and wastage went up enormously of just crops not picked and wasting rotting in the fields. Things like hospital and the healthcare and care industries. Again, a lot of workers coming from overseas and from the EU to work in care homes and hospitals, doing sometimes high level jobs, but quite often doing a lot of the less visible jobs of porterage and cleaning and whatever. So there are a lot of things, and finally in warehousing and logistics, huge numbers of workers there, again coming from Europe. So again, a lot of those workers dried up, and the impact was there's a lot of vacancies, and actually, while that might have been a good news story for the Brexiteers of saying, oh, look at that, now we've got lots more jobs for UK citizens. Well, actually, a lot of UK citizens who can get benefits and all sorts of other things if they're not working, for them, the incentive to go and work in the fields with sort of literally backbreaking labor at a low minimum wage, the jobs weren't being taken. So I think again, there are parallels with what's going on. I mean, there's a huge tariffs being put on Vietnam, Cambodia, other countries who make a lot of clothing and footwear. But actually, if those factories were built in the US, would workers really want to work in them? Would the cost of those workers, be clearly the cost of those workers would be an awful lot more than overseas workers. But you've got to have a clear strategy of what are you trying to create here? A job making shoes, for a kind of a US citizen may not be as attractive as a job making shoes in Vietnam or Cambodia. And I think again there's a lot of uncertainty which has parallels again with the Brexit situation.
I want to get into the labor issue. I want to dig into that a little bit more, but I want to dig into another area here that I think you referenced a little bit in terms of, bringing back, the industry or a manufacturing base, pick your industry back to a location where it isn't right now. There's this assumption that you could just build a factory and it starts producing. A little discussion on the infrastructure necessary to support that manufacturing base. It isn't that you just implement the factory and all of a sudden you've got the ecosystem necessary to support it. And I think that's part of the challenge here, is that while we're talking about sectors, as you indicated before, there are sectors that have been hit harder than others. For example, automotive has been hit really hard within the UK. little discussion about the long-term investment necessary on the infrastructure and the talent necessary, as you're pointing out, to sustain it. And so while we may have an initiative, whether through tax credits or some investment of these factories, it takes years to redesign and realign the supply chain, but yet the impact is focused on short-term changes.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is where, if the tariffs have been announced kind of, at the start of this current administration in the US, and if they've been made very clear, here's what's going to happen in 6 months' time, if people aren't making moves and making the first investments or whatever, then they'll be getting these tariffs. In 12 months' time, this will happen. But as you say, you can't build a factory or even expand a factory in months. These are things that take years. Even if you can, get a factory, set up and expanded with all the plant and machinery bedded down and working, you've got to get a skilled workforce. And, is the workforce in the place where your factory is? Are there enough additional workers? So these are all major questions. And I think, yeah, again, it's this uncertainty around what's been going on. If you're a major global business, given what's happening, are you going to want to invest and make a huge decision thinking, well, what else might be happening? Might another country retaliate and put a huge tariff on stuff exported from the US, out to the global market? Do I want to take that risk? And the more changes there have been, the more that people are going to be very reluctant, and they'll just look at the history and say, "Well, hang on a minute, we invested in a factory in Canada or in Mexico because it was all part of the North American Free Trade Agreement, and now that's suddenly not on." And Nvidia said, "All right, we won't sell our finest chips, our most high quality and high spec chips to China, but we've got permission to sell a lesser design." And now suddenly that's being kind of questioned. So people are going to say, well, I just don't trust, to make a decision because I just don't know what else will happen. And when you're talking about multi-year decisions, that's not a good environment to be to making decisions like that.
Well, truly, uncertainty has become the topic in almost every boardroom today, and almost every kitchen table today is uncertainty. Again, in design, the Brexit and the tariffs in design aren't, they're not wrong in terms of the intent, in terms of what we're trying to achieve, in terms of greater control and greater resiliency. Have you seen that actually play out in greater resiliency and control through Brexit?
Well, in a word, no. I mean, I think if anything, it's just meant that yeah, it's just reduced trade significantly. I mean, the recent article in the Wall Street Journal kind of highlighted just a roundup of some of the statistics that have been basically agreed by economists now, and it was a huge reduction. I think 15% reduction in trade with the EU for the UK, and this is a huge drop in what is their biggest trading partner. And again, it's not necessarily one single industry being hit hugely. It's just kind of lots of small things. I can think of small businesses I know who would import plants, for example, specialist plants for gardeners and so on from Europe, and because every single plant needed to have a kind of an inspection and paperwork and so on, just wasn't economical for a small scale kind of specialist business. So they will be scaled back. I mean, on the other side, you had, British cheese manufacturers exporting into Europe. And again, every piece of cheese pretty well has to be, kind of dealt with. So if you're exporting a lorry load of just the same sort of factory made cheddar, fine, you can probably do that still, and the extra cost is not a big deal. But if you're a more specialist, small scale producer, it just puts barriers there. Even if there are no tariffs in that case, it was just the barriers of paperwork. So in terms of resilience and what it did, no, I mean, there's yeah, it just made businesses weaker. It reduced their sales and therefore reduces their financial resilience.
Yeah, interesting. I think, everybody read the headlines about the border delays when it was first implemented and the increased paperwork and customs complexities. Were there industries that were hit harder than others through Brexit, or was it a, broad stroke across all industries?
I think some of those smaller businesses were really hit hard. I mean, and on both sides, because there are a lot of European businesses just thought we're not going to sell e-commerce, we're not going to do business to B2C e-commerce into the UK anymore. It's just not worth the hassle. If we're selling a £50 item or £100 item, and we've got to fill out a whole lot of customs forms, and there's a risk of a delay, and so on. Even if there isn't any actual tax or tariff or duty added, it's just not worth the hassle. And if that customer then wants to return that item, again, how expensive is that going to be? So a lot of businesses in Europe stop selling to the UK, which you might say will benefit UK e-commerce companies, but it just reduces consumer choice and so on, and probably just reduces purchases anyway. But certainly a lot of UK businesses who were selling to Europe without any problem at all, they could just literally ship it out of their UK warehouse, and there was no barriers. And I work with businesses who do that. And so in some cases, they would just realize they just couldn't really do it, or they'd have the extra expense of setting up warehouses on the continent, or using logistics partners on the continent to do that. But again, it would add to their costs, and actually, move jobs out of the UK, into the continent instead. So yeah, there was a mixture, but I think probably a lot of smaller businesses were hit hard, as well as the sort of headline, car companies and things like that.
I want to get back to the labor issue that you
Mm.
highlighted before, because I think this is an ongoing issue that we're dealing with on both sides of the Atlantic here. Brexit hit labor availability significantly. We just didn't have the workers that were, to offset some of the loss that we had. The tariffs put pressure on labor indirectly. It's not a direct impact on labor, where Brexit was a direct impact on labor.
Mm.
What do you see in terms of parallels between the impact on labor in the US and what you experienced with Brexit?
I mean, it's difficult to know the parallels until it sort of plays out a bit more. I think one thing I would predict is that there's just people don't understand. People will not know until the tariffs really start to take effect for many, many months, if they continue for many months, and they may be withdrawn, who knows. But until that happens, there's just so many impacts that are not foreseen. I mean, one impact which was interesting in the UK is that not only was logistics and warehouse labor impacted, because a lot of those were being, relatively, lower paid jobs. I mean, not the lowest paid jobs, but lower paid jobs, perhaps antisocial hours and so on, that UK citizens didn't seem so willing to apply for. And so a lot of Europeans, particularly say from Central European and slightly lower income countries, were very willing to take. And it wasn't just that, but also, lorry drivers. There are a lot of lorry drivers also who were coming over from the continent. And also, and this is an interesting impact, that there was the whole kind of free movement of vehicles, which meant that, for example, a lorry from Germany would come across with a full load of export goods from Germany into the UK, and then we'll be able to pick up UK goods and take them back to Germany. Now, that's really important because, of course, it means that your vehicles are full both ways. It means that the capacity is available there, and also the costs are shared. For both legs of the journey are essentially, you've got the same vehicle, the same driver, and so on. Now, I can see similar things happening potentially with the US, whereas if the US really drives down imports because it puts such crazy tariffs, and we were hearing that the tariffs on China are now hitting over 200%. I mean, where will it go? It doesn't really make any difference now, because whether it's 100% or 200 or 500, you're just not
You're
going to
stopping
employ
it,
it.
yeah.
But if there's a lot less shipping coming over from China, well, that means there's a lot less capacity going back out of the US, back to Europe, China, wherever it might have been going back to. So that in turn may have a major impact on shipping costs, and indeed lead times, if there's simply not the frequency of shipping. And that's before we've even looked at the other sort of threat, which hasn't been much publicized, where the US, I think it's the Department of Trade, is threatening to apply levies on Chinese-built cargo vessels coming into US ports, and
Right.
those levies could be enormous. And again, if you have that as well as tariffs, I mean, that's going to really impact the flow of shipping. And we saw during COVID how shipping rates could just fluctuate, really enormously. So if capacity isn't there, or if capacity becomes a lot more costly, that again is going to actually impact on US exports, and could really make those less competitive.
It's really a interesting dynamic when you're talking about the labor shift, because there are certain industries that the labor arbitrage is just so significant that you're not going to be able to shift that production unless the consumer is willing to pay substantially more for the product. You indicated apparel. We have workers that in certain, Asian countries making 50 cents a day. And
Mm, mm,
our minimum wage, depending, on the region is different. And we're talking about living wages for individuals. While you may save on the labor, you may, save on the transportation arbitrage and logistics and warehousing when you don't outsource to a Bangladesh or Vietnam. The labor arbitrage is so significant. How do you
mm.
make that up? I don't see the calculation working in favor of reshoring those types of industries.
Well, again, there was an interesting parallel there with Brexit, and certainly when it got to the seasonal agricultural workers, picking fruit in particular, and there was quite a lot of talk and exciting sort of prototypes were being sort of shown on TV of having automated fruit picking machinery, fruit picking robots. Now, I don't know how far it's got. I certainly don't recall seeing it being kind of talked about, you know, for a while. And so certainly one of the arguments would be, okay, well, if British citizens don't want to kind of be picking out in the fields, maybe we can, it's a great incentive to get robots working. And maybe the same will happen in the US. But I guess, actually kind of making clothing automatically and holding together the pieces of material in exactly the right orientation and so on. This is, humans do it for a reason because they got the agility of their of fingers and hands to do that. So again, it could be a spur for robotics and automation in the US, but if it is, it's not going to create so many jobs because you're going to be replacing jobs with automation instead. So yeah, some parallels there to think about.
Interesting. If we go on those unintended consequences, you brought up a statistic before, the Office of Budget Responsibility estimated that there will be a 15% lower than if it had remained in the EU in terms of your overall trade volume. It also
Mm,
indicated long-term productivity is 4% lower than it would have
mm.
been because of the trade barriers. From your perspective, what were some of the unintended consequences of Brexit and that we should pay attention to today?
Um, I guess we talked about some of them. I think it is just, as seems to be sort of happening, as the sort of decisions keep changing on the US tariffs. I think it is just realizing that, we are in a global world and there's very few things that, yeah, maybe wheat and flour, you grow it in the Midwest, you mill it in the Midwest, you bag it up and you distribute it around the US, apart from what's get exported and apart from, Canadian wheat, which might get imported. But, there are some products, sure, that you grow and manufacture and consume within the country, and they're simpler. But even then, I mean, who knows what kind of, fertilizers, are made from different chemicals, and do some of those chemicals get imported from overseas? Even then, probably you'll find that there's a surprising element, in what you think is a totally domestic supply chain where there are still overseas elements coming, being imported. And I think that's the biggest thing, really, is that in terms of impact, I think it's just, unless you really understand every industry, incredibly well, you just don't understand the impact until you start putting these tariffs in place. And I think, with respect to the departments that have been involved in, drawing up the famous sort of, poster kind of a cardboard thing that the president held up at that Rose Garden Liberation Day press conference. I very much doubt there's been, hundreds and hundreds of people analyzing every key industry for, many months to really understand all those implications and work out in a very, very nuanced way where they will apply a tariff and where they won't. It seems very, very blunt tools have been used, and there will be an awful lot of unexpected consequences. And I think some of those are the fact that already it's been, there's been sort of some press articles about it. The fact that, it's not just kind of, it's not as if you're just importing, like, say, 10% of the cost of a product is imported. Okay, that becomes 12% of the cost of your product. It's the fact that you import it, then you're re-exported an assembly, that will have further work done in Canada, then it gets re-imported. I mean, these are really complicated trade flows. And if you've got tariffs every step of the way, what you might think is a 10% tariff actually might increase the cost of the good by 30, 40, 50%. Who knows? So yeah, there's a lot to understand, which I don't think has been done yet.
Interesting. A lot of lessons to be learned, a lot of learnings to be experienced over the next
Yeah.
days and months. Alastair, we could talk for hours on this topic, and unfortunately, we are out of time. But I do want to thank you today for sharing your insights. I have a feeling we're going to talk again very soon.
I think this won't be ending anytime soon.
No.
That's for sure. I look forward to doing that.
All the best, Alastair. Thanks again.
Great to talk to you, Abe. Bye.